Appreciate everyone heading out nice and early. We got some more folks coming in. So thank you, Jeff and Doug. I really appreciate the opportunity to do this knowledge share for the conference. So, for the last several years, we've really been focusing on the connectivity gap. Programs like BEAD, and before that, like BTOP, they made or are making, historical investments and helping, connect communities. So, but today, we're going to explore a different question. We're going to ask something different. What happens after broadband? What's going to come next, right? So we have last mile connectivity that we're focused on, and the future isn't going to be broadband deployment. The future is really going to be infrastructure orchestration. And let me give you an example. So my former role, so I'm currently at AtkinsRéalis. I'm the Vice President of Infrastructure and Cyber. But just previously to that, I was a Chief Technology Officer for the state of Maryland. So oversaw their wide area network, data center, public-private partnership agreements. So one of the things I recognized in Maryland was we needed to make sure that we were truly orchestrating, planning, funding, and then ultimately executing as an entire state along with the private sector. So what we did was we stood up the Digital Infrastructure Group through an executive order. And through that executive order, we ended up having 11 state agencies that were part of that, first ever in the country. Again, it was called DIG, right? Very creative. I don't know if I should take credit for that or not take credit for that, but we also, what we were able to do was also bring in the private sector as part of these expansion plans and then ultimately executing on it. And we did successfully. So we ended up, the first, one of the first projects we ended up doing was being able to apply for an ARC grant, and we were a participant, and we ended up winning it. So as a result, we were able to, for $250K as the state, and the private sector was the lead applicant, but for 250 grand, we got 26 miles of fiber and 96 grand. That's a pretty good cost-benefit recovery. So one of the things that we ended up doing was we understood, and I believe we all need to understand that there's three forces that are reshaping infrastructure investment. So we all know that, AI, right? AI is just, it's out there front page, data centers, hyperscaler data centers, AI data centers, right? So we know that all the applications that everyone has that uses today, whether you use it at work, use it at home, use it on your phone. I think the average person has something like 20 some odd applications on their phone. So, so applications are absolutely driving demand. And then the market growth is accelerating. I was attending a session yesterday with Vantage. And, over the next several years, I can't remember how many years it is, but it's upwards of like 1,800 data centers that are planned. And, which is just incredible. Again, AI applications, the market growth is accelerating. And then data. Think about the data that is being generated today. And again, we are constantly evaluating what type of data, whose data, where is that data coming from. The global data center data creation is going to exceed just a crazy number. It's absolutely just an insane number. So we're looking at, compute, storage, and one of the things that one of my panelists will talk about is an alternative to that as well. And to me, that's also why, I wanted to make sure we have and had, Brent on this panel as well, is to talk about, some of the alternatives to the data center piece and how that plugs into, the multi-purpose builds for the Goldilocks builds. So when these forces converge, and the infrastructure, it really just begins to behave a little bit differently. So let's think about what we're doing today. There's what I call the digital fabric. So we're talking about the edge, we're talking about streets, we're talking about CAIs and connected communities and connected states, and then we're also talking about systems. And if we think about this today, we're all involved in it in different ways, whether you're private sector, whether you're public sector, but this ultimately is what we're talking about, is getting this fabric connected to the projects that we work, that we design, that we build. So from our standpoint, my standpoint, what I recognized in Maryland was, wait a minute, I worked at the Maryland Department of Information Technology. If I only planned my own mission, planned for my own mission to serve my own mission, then, that's not very efficient. Because everything that I design and build and connect using that public sector network, others can benefit for it. And we recognize this, I've recognized this early on, so everything that we planned and built was based off of this fabric, because I knew that anytime that fiber went down the corridor, there was somebody else that could benefit and serve on that. And the benefits also helped me, because I was able to save 25%, 50%, because I was able to bring in other partners. On the ARC grant, it was $250K for 26 miles. Do the math. It was just, incredible cost benefit from what we were able to do. So when we look at this fabric, transportation, it depends on communication. Public safety depends on connectivity. Healthcare depends on the cloud infrastructure. And when we look at economic development, it really depends on all of it. When we look at government services, when we look at other aspects of what we're involved in, we're talking about pretty much everything there on that fabric. So if infrastructure is now interconnected in some ways, should we really invest in just one mission at a time? People do not consume broadband. We don't consume broadband. What we consume are outcomes. So let's talk about the Goldilocks, right? So the Goldilocks build, again, another creative name, right? So I don't want to take credit for that one either. But it's really the sweet spot. So when we look at what I call the broadband stack in front of you, broadband is the foundation, right? Just in general, broadband's the foundation. We're talking about fiber. fiber first, not only fiber, right? Not just fiber. We're going to use wireless as well. But what we're talking about is the use of broadband stacking up with private networks, stacking up with data centers and internet exchanges, stacking up with public networks, and then ultimately layering wireless on top where it becomes practical. And then from a Goldilocks zone, we're talking about 4 main pillars. If that build can be designed to serve, pass, make the business model better, more positive for public and private, to serve transportation variables, so think of ITS devices and so forth, vertical assets, CAIs, and state and community needs. If that build is able to pass or serve those 4 pillars, we're optimizing that single public investment or private investment to the broadest of needs. So for us, what we wanted to do was, we wanted to close the outcome gap, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the outcomes that come from connectivity. So people, again, consume outcomes. Healthcare, public safety, economic development. Broadband is absolutely the foundation. Again, it's a general term, but everybody understands kind of what that is, right? Everybody understands what that is. But outcomes are the destination. That's where we're trying to go. So all the builds that everyone's involved in, BEAD, private sector, if it's Google Fiber, if it's somebody, some other organization, it's really about getting the outcomes of that connectivity. So as I had mentioned, there's 4 key pillars. So and this is really for, the next few, I really, I'm hoping the state broadband office directors are here or their representatives are here. Because to me, this is the future. This is where we should be going as a state, looking out for the needs of its citizens. So there's 4 pillars, right? Transportation, so think of ITS devices, high priority corridors, any key long haul or middle mile corridors, routes. Vertical assets, so towers, buildings, CAIs, and then ultimately on and underserved communities. So let's think about this for a minute. There was a flood if you're from Maryland, there was a flood in Ellicott City, Maryland. This was back in 2016, I think 2018. And there was a handful of people. There was a flash flood within minutes. Swept people away right off Main Street, also within the park that was just adjacent to it. And several people were killed by this flash flood. And there's a tower right there. There's a tower, but that tower didn't really serve the appropriate connection and coverage gap. And one of the things that we've recognized, and one of the last projects I was working on, was getting a new tower and getting fiber to that tower. Because fire and rescue were in the river right next to Patapsco, right next to Ellicott City, in the park, which is called Patapsco Park, with no cell connectivity, no public safety radio connectivity. And we're talking about, in Howard County, Maryland, if you're familiar with Maryland, it's, a really populated area, but no connectivity. So think about this from a Goldilocks build perspective. Get fiber to the tower, okay? State fiber, could be even private fiber. But getting fiber to that tower, not only provides cell coverage, it provides public safety coverage, it can provide, wireless internet service providing, service to surrounding areas. But again, it's one connection to be able to serve multiple missions, getting to that vertical asset. And this is where the opportunity lies for these broadband offices and for the feds to start thinking about, if you're going to start creating programs and funding programs or doing non-deployment revisions, prioritize projects that are going to have a multi-purpose, multi-mission objective and outcome versus single mission, right? Single project, getting to a home, getting to a business, and that's it, right? Because that's really what we're talking about from a BEAD perspective is we're going to build down the road, we're going to pass some houses, we're going to get them connected, maybe we get a business. Well, what about everything else? So we have a dollar, for every dollar going out, it's just going to serve one mission. Well, if we have, that same type of corridor and going down that corridor, but we can hit a home and a business, we can get an ITS device, we can get closer to a tower, and maybe there's an elementary school along the way or a library, that our money's going a little bit further, right, versus $1 to one mission. I'd rather have $1 to 4 missions. There's another example. I was in one of the roundtables yesterday, so roundtables have been outstanding. They've been great. So for the roundtable, we were talking about a county in Colorado. And in that county, they've had several wildfires. So let's think about, wildfires today, over the past few years, they've been prominent, right, in our lexicon in terms of what we've seen on television and everything else. So think about this perspective from a Goldilocks build. We're going to go down and build out one of these corridors in one of these remote, let's call them remote-ish type counties. Well, most likely there's probably some level of park in the area, right? We've already talked about parks. Parks not only, provide cell coverage for participants in those parks, but they also provide a public safety aspect in parks. So let's call it, we're gonna get a CAI covered in there because we're gonna pass a park. And then we're gonna go along that corridor and we're gonna put a camera and a lightning detector, every, let's call it every mile on that corridor. Think about the time at which you get a lightning detector, a lightning strike, and a camera at the same time and know exactly when that wildfire would start. Think about what that can save in terms of cost and money, resources, by, again, thinking differently on how we truly plan digital infrastructure and broadband out from a state perspective. So, park, build to the park, right? Past the park, we're getting better cell phone coverage for the citizens who want to camp and stream Netflix while they're camping and everything else. We have the ITS devices. So from public safety, we have cameras out there. We have a lightning strike detector out there. And if there is a fire that occurs, that camera can be able to see that, and they can deploy out. And then getting to, again, I'm sure I'm gonna bet there's probably some and underserved homes and businesses along that route. So one build, multiple outcomes, right? We talk about dig once, right? Everybody's, every state just about has a dig once policy. And, Maryland had a dig once policy. And I'm like, no, it's just, I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it'll ever be feasible. Dig once. I do not think it'll ever be feasible. However, we can dig smart or smarter. We can plan and we can build far more smarter and practical and have the funds go a lot further if we slow down in order to speed up a little bit. So once we identify these opportunities, let's think about how do we organize investments. Why this doesn't work, right? The reason why it doesn't work in a lot of places is the governance piece is really, really hard. It's really hard because you have to work with people. It becomes about people, not about technology. So the governance part is what has to get tackled first and foremost. And the reason why it usually isn't in place, and it hasn't been in place throughout, numerous states, is because if I operate on my own, and I plan, and I find money, and I do it on my own, it's extremely simple. It's my work, it's my budget. I'm just going to go forward and do my build and do my connectivity. So what we did in Maryland is we figured out the governance part. Wrote an executive order. It didn't mandate you must build, you must dig once, you must do. No. What it did say was you must work together to plan and fund statewide expansion for digital and broadband infrastructure. So it didn't mandate that you must do this and only do this, and every fiber build from a public perspective, always had to go, through this digital infrastructure group. No. What it did say, though, is you have to plan it, and you have to find funding. And then when it's practical, we ended up, doing a build. When it wasn't, we didn't, right? But we had this pipeline of projects that would come in to the state that we began to evaluate and decide what should we do with it. So if you can get the governance figured out in your state, by policy, by law, by executive order, that is the key, is figuring out the governance piece. Again, the challenge is you got to work with people. And that's hard when you have to work with humans sometimes. But when you do that, the benefits are massive. We're talking about a statewide shared prioritization. We're talking about optimizing funds. We're talking about being able to generate revenue faster, getting speed to market faster, getting through the permit process faster. Because again, this is not just public sector, this is also private sector that's involved, because you can bring them along with you. And I guarantee that you're going to have folks that are going to be absolutely interested on the private side if the public is doing some build. That's easy to work out what's going to be the right fit for that project, that joint build. And then ultimately, that divide begins to close. So the goal is, it's not eliminating complexity, because again, the governance is massively complex depending on your state. The goal is really maximizing public value. And who should coordinate all this? This is the opportunity for state broadband offices, if you want it. Some states, it's not going to happen. Everything turns into a pumpkin in 5 years because of state law or whatever it is. However, there are states where you do have that opportunity, where state broadband offices can go from being an administrator to an orchestrator and a planner and a convener of statewide broadband expansion. The opportunity is there. I was at an NGA event, and it was amazing. You know, it was, I would say the room was like maybe a 40-60 split on state broadband offices in terms of what they wanted to do. Some were like, hey, fine, this thing rolls down, in 5 years I'm done. You know, I told my staff, hey, we're done. And others were like, no, I want more. You know, I have a vision as well. So when we think about this, though, right, going back to the Goldilocks approach, who owns transportation? Well, transportation does. Who owns healthcare? Healthcare. Who owns education? Education. Every agency optimizes for its mission. However, I believe state broadband offices are uniquely positioned to optimize for statewide outcomes. Think of all of the planning that has been going on with state broadband offices, the mapping, the level of understanding of where the coverage is and is not within a state. That knowledge, that data that the broadband offices have is a massive advantage in understanding what the state needs in the future. Because guess what? When I was at Do It, as you know, in my role, Maryland is uniquely positioned. It owns two networks, public safety network called Maryland First, and Network Maryland, which is a public sector service provider. Uniquely positioned. But typically CIOs of a DOT, of DOIT, of different agencies, they're focused on their mission. Keeping networks secure. Cyber is a massive, massive effort that CIOs are focused on. They're not thinking about connectivity. A CIO of a DOT, they're not thinking about that. They're thinking about keeping their apps secure, keeping their apps up. High availability to the services that they provide to the traveling public. So those CIOs are focused on their mission. What about connectivity? We all know, everybody in here knows that, you know, when we look at BEAD from that perspective, it's about last mile. It is a last mile program. What we're talking about is looking at it broader, looking at it from over the top and saying, okay, well, what's next? How do we continue to evolve our state to make sure that digital fabric is actually deployed in the areas of the state that need it the most, that do not have that level of connection? Because this is where we're going, right? So state broadband offices, again, they're already doing it. They're already operating across the public sector agency boundaries, and they're already operating across the private sector. They're really doing a tremendous job of brokering both sides of that, making sure the state and the citizens are served, and also making sure that the program is operating correctly. But it's beyond BEAD. So those state broadband offices, you have to start now. We're talking about policy that needs to get implemented to formalize things. We're talking about potentially state law. We're talking about budgets. So it's starting now, right now, socializing those conversations with others in your state. Having those conversations. Because if you wait until, a year before BEAD ends, it's too late. We all know how how quickly or slowly things move in state government. So the opportunity is like right now. Like have that conversation. If that's the desire for that state broadband office, for that state broadband director, the opportunity is right now to go and start having those conversations and positioning where you're going to sit across true statewide connectivity. Because the business model and the business case and the use case is there. There are massive efficiencies, and we're going to talk about that with Matt and Brent in terms of our panel. So what does the future look like? So this isn't a broadband strategy. This is a statewide infrastructure strategy, is what this is. States that coordinate the best will create the greatest public value. So again, with DIG, we were able to have massive savings. I don't know if anybody's done the math yet, but 26 miles, 250K, pretty good, right? As Larry David would say, if there's any Curb Your Enthusiasm fans in here. But this is done with influence, right? So broadband offices, it's this realization that, can I influence without authority potentially, right? And I think that's the leadership opportunity that these SBOs have in front of us. Because remember, CIOs are focused on their mission. They're focused on cyber. They're focused on digital accessibility. They're focused on IT procurement consolidation, technology rationalization. Trust me, they are focused on their mission, and rightly so. We're talking about an incredibly challenging job that CIOs have. So from that perspective, this is the opportunity. This is where the gap can be closed. And I believe the first generation of state broadband offices focused on connecting communities, and rightly so. That was their mission. The next generation will focus on coordinating infrastructure and all the different elements. Remember, BEAD closes the connectivity gap. Goldilocks builds close the outcome gap. Thank you. So we've talked about the vision, we've talked about the framework, we've talked about why SBOs are uniquely positioned. So the next question, logical question, is how do we actually make this real? And that's exactly what we're going to explore with our panel. So I'd like to introduce Matt Smith, who's the Chief Architect, Network Architect for Skyline Technology Solutions, and Brent Legg, Executive Vice President with Connected Nation IXP.
Absolutely.
All right, so guys, I appreciate you coming on board and doing the panel. So, this is to both you guys. We've spent the last several years focused on getting broadband deployed, or, almost deployed, right? As we look at the next decade, what does success look like? Is it simply universal broadband availability, something bigger? Where are you with that, Matt? Let's start with you.
It's absolutely something bigger. So I think it's important you have a little bit of background for me. I'm a network architect, so I spend most of the time building the infrastructure that goes on top of the fiber. But I'm uniquely positioned, I think, to understand where you're building this or where you're going with this idea, because I've spent my entire career working in the public sector. So I started working for DOT, which was both a challenge and an awesome opportunity, because it taught me that networking challenges are immense in that field. because by definition, it's a multi-tenant organization. You've got field operations, you've got internal carpeted space, and then within the DOT, you also have different segments of business because you've got the MVAs, the SHAs, the highway administrations, the port authorities, all have a different mission. And they never talk to each other, and they never coordinate. And that was just one agency. And then I had the opportunity to work on the Network Maryland program that you mentioned earlier, and have been on that program since inception. And I realized that that was ubiquitous across all of state government. And then even within the counties and municipalities, there just wasn't enough coordination. So for me, I look at the opportunity that BEAD and all these other programs put into state infrastructure, and it's a huge miss for me. Because as an advocate for governmental networks, I see that I absolutely want residences covered. You can't survive in this digital economy without having broadband access. It's a given. But what we're missing is understanding that that infrastructure build could be a platform. It's not being built as a platform. It's built as a single mission. Let me get broadband access. But that miss and the ability to change the script on how we're actually deploying that, and instead of bypassing infrastructure locations where we could have tie-ins to signals and all the other assets that are along that side of the road or along that corridor, we're just building to the last mile. And then we're in a position afterwards where we're looking, saying, well, now I have this signal that I need this corridor. I recently did a job in Pennsylvania where they had to put signals in on a signals corridor because they have a couple of parks and regional events that when they have concerts or other things, the amount of traffic into that region expands exponentially. And they need to be able to dynamically control those roads and react in real time to the overloading conditions, and they couldn't do it without connected signals. That area was already built out for residential broadband. They couldn't access the fiber because there were no access points along that highway where they could actually intercept that fiber infrastructure. It's there, it's just unusable. So they had to rebuild along that same corridor. So to me, that's what we need to do. We need to treat this infrastructure build as an opportunity to build the platform.
Awesome, thanks, Matt. Brent?
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, right, there are trillions of dollars being invested in AI right now, from data centers to fiber optic networks to support those data centers, to all the Internet of Things and the intelligent applications that are going to be driven by those AI data centers. But all of that investment is not happening in a coordinated fashion, right? So data centers, hyperscale facilities will come to a county, they'll ask for permission to build, they'll go through a permitting process, they'll go through a series of community meetings, they'll talk about the advantages of their facility, and they won't really talk about it from how that facility will holistically benefit the community or the region or the state. So data centers are being built independently, fiber optic networks are being built independently, they don't interconnect in the community, right? So you heard me talk about yesterday our Wichita facility. Wichita is a city of 330,000 people roughly, bedroom community of another 200,000 people. And yet from an internet perspective, it's hanging completely off of a building 2 blocks from here in Denver, or at a building in Kansas City, Missouri. So all of the fiber networks, whether you're on Cox Communications, or you're on AT&T, or you're on Lumen, or you're on Zayo, or you're on Cogent, or you name it, all of those networks are hauling that traffic back to Denver or Kansas City first. So there is no place for networks to meet. So if you have a transportation signaling or ITS device, or you have a camera or lightning sensor, as you mentioned in your talk, and that is on one network, the data from that application sensor device is moving through, if in the case of Wichita, is moving through a distant hub before it ever comes back to benefit the local community. So when we think of, in our very narrow lane, right, of how do you start to get infrastructure coordinated, How do you start to reduce latency? How do you start to create a marketplace for competition for things like transport and IP transit? How do you make sure that the data centers that are located in and around a community can actually interconnect with all the networks in that community? You have to build an interconnection facility like we're building in Wichita, and hope to do in 135 more cities across the country. So, and broadband offices, to your point, I think have a role in coordinating that. Certainly some have more capabilities than others. And then there also has to be a willingness by community anchor institutions and city councils and emergency response agencies, et cetera, to also participate. Because it's not possible to do it, to do that level of coordination if you don't have buy-in across the public and private sector.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Matt, from a physical architecture perspective, what separates a traditional broadband build from a true multi-purpose infrastructure build?
So I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you talked about myopic vision, right? So, and it's not a bad thing. Everybody who's in state or agency level functionality, whether it's the CIO or the drivers, they have a mission that they're supposed to adhere to, and rightly so, that's what they concentrate on. And when you build out broadband, you're concentrating on that mission, right? I need to get to these underserved communities, which is, in my opinion, an altruistic, incredibly serving way of helping the citizens, but it is myopic, right? As you mentioned, there are other needs that you're going to pass along that build that just aren't being accounted for. So for me, an actual multi-purpose build needs to look and plan 30 years out. And I think you mentioned, like, is that viable? Is a Dig Once policy really going to be 100% successful? No, I agree with you. You can't, your crystal ball is only as good as your crystal ball is, but not even trying is a travesty. Not even sitting down at the table, and I've had experience over my career, it has traditionally, until Dig came, it's been bottom up. It's been a grassroots effort of getting all of the different agencies and including counties and municipalities that have an interest in building infrastructure, or may have an interest, or don't even know that they should have an interest, to a table, and getting them to understand that, hey, we have an opportunity to build down this highway stretch, and we're going to do it. Are there needs that you can either have today or think about that you may have in the next 30 years that we should attend to be able to account for them? Will we get it right 100%? Probably not. Will there be handholds and splice cases in the locations that we need them to be exactly for every other use case that we haven't thought about yet? Probably not. But if we can start by thinking like, well, if I'm gonna pass a cloverleaf, I should have a splice case in that cloverleaf at any intersection point, because at some point somebody's gonna want to build a lateral, and they usually follow the roads. So I think thinking ahead and lateral builds and having separate conduit systems for access versus long haul, and building them once in the same trench, that's thinking ahead. That's putting money down and investment for the future. And the hardest part is that investment sometimes doesn't have an immediate return. And I can tell you through experience that the return comes. Like the movie back in the day where if you build it, they will come. I've seen it happen. Once the infrastructure is in the ground and it's available, it's amazing the friction that it releases with respect to new capabilities that the agencies that are responsible for missions all of a sudden realize that, to your point, I now have fiber optic connectivity to a park. I can put FLIR cameras up and look for IR signatures that I couldn't do before, and actually write AI applications against watching those cameras remotely to say, I've got a flare, it's not supposed to be there, let me alert somebody, and try to save lives. So to me, that's what it takes to have a true build that provides value.
So Brent, many communities still think project by project. Why is that approach becoming increasingly difficult to justify when public dollars become limited?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the BEAD program itself, right, this is a $42.5 billion program that's still not fully off the ground after 5 years. I think in many ways, federal government has gotten in the way on both sides of the aisle in seeing that money spent efficiently, but there are also no incentives in the program to really ensure that when fiber infrastructure is built out at the last mile in the community, how it benefits the broader community, or where it connects to. So there's the focus on building to homes and businesses, but where's the other end of that connection? Is that fiber interconnecting and exchanging traffic locally or not, right? There's no holistic approach to that. There's just get the people connected to some type of last mile connectivity, and the rest of the ecosystem will take care of itself. And I think part of the problem too is a lack of understanding of the broader ecosystem, the internet ecosystem, beyond just last mile. So getting really experienced, people coming to these government sector jobs with private sector experience and understanding all of the layers of the OSI model. Like, I mean, how many politicians could you ask, do you understand how the internet ecosystem works and what the OSI model is? You probably get blank stares, right? So I think it's incumbent upon everyone to become more educated about the broader ecosystem, and then solutions, I think, will start to become easier to implement. But right now, it's so siloed, it's so focused on, narrowly on individual network builds, without any incentive to create, broader community benefit infrastructure. Some states have tried to tweak their BEAD application rules to enable that, but that's by far the exception rather than the rule.
So for both you guys, so looking at transportation corridors, vertical assets, public safety networks, CAIs, middle mile infrastructure, how do we move from funding individual projects to funding shared infrastructure that serves multiple stakeholders simultaneously?
I'll take the first part. All right. So for me, I think your first part of your presentation hit it perfectly. We've organized our agencies and our infrastructure builders around missions, and rightly so. Like they've got things they need to do, and we failed to grasp that communications infrastructure is ubiquitous. Every agency, every entity, every mission relies on critical communications in order to support the mission. And they start to look at it as, well, now I have to build that for my mission myopically. So what we need to do is find a way to influence those mission builders that have the funding. State highways usually one of the first I try to work with, because they do get the federal funding and the ability, and they have the money most of the time to be able to do that, and try to influence them. And the pushback I always get is, look, I'd love to build the extra conduit. I'd love to build the extra infrastructure and the handholds. It's a 10% cost increase. Who's going to pay for that? And then it stops. Because for them, they're being graded on their ability to meet their mission and build the infrastructure that they need for the highway system to operate. They're not getting graded on or bidding points for their ability to then enable the healthcare system or enable the other agencies to do their mission. So for me, I think what needs to change is we need a central organization that has funding ability to be able to integrate that gap or provide for that gap. So you mentioned whether it's the broadband office or it's the central state IT, whatever you want to name it, it just needs to come with the money so that it's not a mandate, it's a, hey, there's a benefit to actually bringing your project to this central organization and allowing other entities to look at, well, hey, how could I benefit from that and can we pull funding? So I think that's what's missing.
Yeah, I think the real challenge is if you look in other areas of government where there is shared infrastructure, think transportation infrastructure, you think airports, think shipping ports, things like that. Typically, if you think about highways, typically that's a government-run, government-instituted, shared infrastructure. In the telecommunications industry, there are many, many private sector players. So I think one of the challenges, of course, is getting the government to work well with the private sector in a way that acknowledges there's a role for the private sector to play. There is in most cases, a profit motivation associated with that. And then if you're going to build shared infrastructure, how do you make it accessible to the private sector in a way that is attractive for their use, right, and coordinated, and that it actually meets a real need. I think, probably the state of Utah has done, at least from my own personal vantage point, has done a pretty exceptional job of coordinating infrastructure with the private sector to achieve end goals. But again, that's the exception rather than the norm. So I think you have to look at it through the lens of, yes, there are private sector companies, yes, there are profit motivations. How do you make the shared infrastructure something that they want and need to utilize, and that it's fair, and that it's open access under reasonable terms and conditions, and that takes away the risk of that collaboration. And if you can do those things, then I think you can be very successful in that regard.
So one of the things we ended up doing that I'd mentioned briefly was we had an ARC grant in the state of Maryland, and ended up, I contributed $250K and got the, was part of the winning application where we got the 26 miles. And that project, what we were able to do was serve 6 ITS devices. It was like 4 or 5 CAIs. It brought the build, it cut off about 3 or 4 miles to get very close to a tower. It got us like within 1,000 feet. And it went right through the heart of an underserved location. And so we, the state, got 96 fibers, and the nonprofit service provider, it's called the Maryland Broadband Cooperative in Maryland, they were the private sector side of that, right? So we were the public sector side, they were the private sector. So those are examples of how, states can work together with the private sector where they can benefit as well, because that business model for the private sector got really, really good cutting off 3 or 4 miles. Imagine that. If you can serve 100 homes, and in that process of evaluating take rate and everything else, you're able to knock off 3 or 4 miles of build and get you, that's a pretty good business model improvement. So with that in mind, guys, when evaluating projects today, what characteristics tell you a build has achieved the Goldilocks balance? Not overbuilt, not underbuilt, but positioned to truly create long-term value.
It's a hard one to measure. And I think that's the business case that we're trying to solve for the broadband offices. How do you provide that criteria in addition to what I consider the easy criteria of homes hit, right? And I think that criteria really needs to come from the agencies and other entities that are going to leverage that. So I think the evaluators for awarders need to have some subjective criteria where they can look at the extra additional value statements that those builds are coming across. For example, there's no point system in the BEAD for being able to hit a public safety tower. There's no point system for picking up ITS assets along the side of the road. So having the flexibility for those that are awarding that to be able to apply additional value, and I agree it needs to be in a measured, systematic way so that it's repeatable. But coming up with that, I think, is what we need to solve. And I think you mentioned it earlier, like the issue is that's a harder path. And I think we need to start taking the harder path, because the easiest path in my lifetime, throughout my career, I have never built a network the easy way that stood the test of time. I always had to go back and fix that Band-Aid that we put in because we couldn't do it right the first time, and it usually cost more money. So I'd like to avoid that and do it right the first time. Brent?
Yeah, I would say that you want to try to maximize the opportunity for the money injected, right? So it's in the AI-driven economy that we're moving into. It's hard to even imagine how much bandwidth is going to be consumed not just by humans using AI-driven applications, but by the AI applications talking to themselves, agentic AI. Inference in agentic AI is going to change so much about how networks are architected and how much those networks are utilized by community anchor institutions like schools and universities and libraries and healthcare entities, but also what happens in the home. So in some ways, it's almost hard to imagine being in a position to overbuild. The only situation you get into is if you're spending a whole lot of money on something with little return on that investment. But the amount of bandwidth that is going to be required to undergird everything that is coming in AI is hard to even fathom. I think we're just at the inflection point on the hockey stick, and things are going to increase exponentially over the next 5 years. So I would say if you're in the public sector, if you're a public sector agency and you're thinking about this, think about ways in which that you can invest in infrastructure that is going to be resilient, that is not subject to single points of failure, that covers the community with reliable, high bandwidth capacity, connectivity, and to do as much of that now, because it's always going to be cheaper now to do it now rather than later, as we see prices going up on everything. And I'm a little biased, but I would say also another important element of this is to think about how data traffic in your community is actually routed and exchanged, and ensure that there's actually a place for that to occur in the community. Right now, we're focused on cities of 100,000 people and more. But I think in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a need for local, neutral network interconnection buildings in cities of 5,000 to 10,000 people. So that's where we're headed, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there.
So just in closing, last question. So 30 seconds apiece for you guys. If we're sitting here 5 years from now, what will separate the states that simply built broadband from the states that successfully built a digital infrastructure strategy?
I'd say preparedness. I think there's a wave of digitization that's going to happen in all aspects of government that some are seeing, some leaders are seeing, and some leaders are going to see in hindsight. And they're going to be in a position where they don't have the infrastructure to meet the needs. And I don't want the state, any state in this country, to be in that position, because I think everyone needs ubiquitous access to healthcare. We need all of the sensors that we can, like you mentioned, the lightning sensors. I was an architect on the Baltimore City Watch program, where they have CCTV cameras. I know it's an interesting topic these days, but it did deter crime. So I think as we start to digitize our infrastructure and we're managing our water systems more efficiently, et cetera, that data has to be pulled back and then has to be analyzed. So having the people who really look forward and have that infrastructure there and could very easily hook up those additional insights on or roadside assets, et cetera, are going to have an easier time, and that friction to adopt those technologies is going to be non-existent for them, versus having to build an entire infrastructure to support that new mission.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, and I think the other piece is economic prosperity and security of people. To make sure that privacy rights are protected, to make sure that people have an opportunity to participate in the new economy, because we are entering, whether we like it or not, and it's going to be uncomfortable for some people, maybe uncomfortable for a lot of people, as we move into an economy that is AI-driven, that there is economic prosperity for everyone involved, and that people's ability to be safe, to earn a living, to raise a family, to participate in the economy, to do well for themselves, to be safe, and to have their privacy protected. I think those are all of the things that are going to have to be balanced, and it's going to take a lot of work to get there. So,
thanks, Brent. So just in closing, I'll be quick. Appreciate you guys and your perspectives, and you know, what you guys are doing in the industry and for your clients as well. So, you know, what we're talking about, you know, in partiality to the state broadband offices is post-BEAD, potentially there's this identity crisis that may be there for state broadband offices. And not just the state broadband offices, but for the state in its entirety. So it's really who is going to, you know, step into the void and understand that the opportunity is a single public investment serving the broadest of needs. So appreciate it. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.